Michelle and Nick, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I wish I could see you all, but I'm appreciating knowing that you're out there in the ether. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
So, as near as I can recall, the way this started was Nick and I each got an email from the chair of the English department saying they were really hoping that someone from creative writing might be willing to lead a book group discussion, book club discussion, because it's been English professors typically and other scholarly types. And I responded immediately saying, I think Nick and I should do it together. And Nick, said, yeah, sure, that's great. And they said, let us know what the book is. And I looked at the previous books and I thought, I don't want to do like a classic great read. I want to introduce people to a really good book I've read recently by a contemporary author, something that's just been published. And I was just about to text Nick to say, I have an idea. I just read this fantastic collection of stories by this young Black woman, Danielle Evans, when I got a text from Nick saying, how about this? Why don't we do Danielle Evans' new book? So I thought the place for us to begin is to talk about why, considering how many books come out at any given time and how many books Nick and I read, we both picked the same book because we're very different people. There's 30 years between us. I'm a New Yorker. I'm sure you can't tell that from the way I talk. Nick's from Mississippi. Nick is gay. I'm a parent. He's not. What on earth, Nick?
Well, I'm a parent to my plants.
Well, and to all your students.
And to all my students, yes.
What made you immediately say, let's do the Office of Historical Corrections?
Well, there were several reasons, but the number one reason is one that we both share, and that's we're both big lovers of short story collections. And this was a beautiful short story collection, one that when I first read it, before I ever knew about the book club, I read in nearly one sitting. I had read a couple of the stories beforehand in various publications. Two of them, I think, were featured in various Best American short story anthologies. And so I knew of those, but I also knew of Danielle Evans because a little over 10 years ago, she published the collection Behind Me Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. And that was a big hit as a collection as well. That was sort of one that was passed around in my MFA, PhD workshops as like a writer we should pay attention to because of her level of expertise with the form. And so I was very excited for this book. And when I read it, it did not disappoint. And the other reason I picked it was because this collection has, if we think about a short story collection being something that is often not appreciated by the mainstream, something that is also not appreciated by the mainstream is this hybrid form of the novella, right? The short novel. And this book also contains one of those, and I love the novella form. I remember when I was an MFA student here, I took your novella class and we read some beautiful novellas, and I'm just fascinated with that sort of length of fiction and what you can do and what you can't do in that sort of particular form. So that was like my reasons for it. And also she reminded me of some of my favorite writers too, which we can get into, but.
Yeah. I realize I'm interviewing you because that's but because I'm curious about this because everything you say is true for me too, all those things. As you know, I love novellas. I write novellas. I'm obsessed with novellas. I even write nonfiction that I think of as memorellas because they're too long to be considered essays, but they're not long enough to be books. But aside from that, for me, some of the particular thematic strands of this book, they're the things that like get me most. For example, so many of the stories have these really important mother-daughter connections. I shouldn't say so many, but some of the stories have these really important, tightly bound mother-daughter connections at the heart of the story. And then there are stories with these really tight sibling relationships that completely fascinate me. And maybe one of my favorite things, the motif of friendship particularly female friendship. You mentioned to me the other day, you know, the portrait of the frenemy in the title novella, the relationship between Cassie and Genevieve, which you don't ever see done well. But all of those friendships, even the friendship, the 1 day long friendship between the cousins in Alcatraz, the mother of the protagonist and her cousin, they're so lovingly drawn, and that may be my favorite subject in all of literature. And then there's the romantic connections, all these women who are having romantic connections with men that they're determined not to be too involved with. I mean, it all speaks my language. And then beyond that, the way she's writing about race, the way she's writing about blackness, and the way she writes about whiteness, um, just all knock my socks off. Are there other? Did I miss anything? You're
Yeah,
not.
I think one of the things too that we spoke about that we really liked about this book, and we sort of felt in every story, was there was a certain layering that was happening with each piece. Like I was just rereading one of the stories, the second story in the collection, Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain, about the wedding and this sort of woman coming into this wedding as being friends of the groom and being this objective suspect. I thought I knew where that story was going. And then midway through, it turns into a kind of quasi road trip between the bride and the groom's like old friend from this like traumatic experience that they like shared with each other. And that relationship takes so many different turns that I had no idea it was going that way. And it was just really, really wonderful. I sort of feel the same way when I'm in a good writer's hands, and I forget that I'm reading and I'm just along for the ride, no pun intended, of them just taking me wherever the story takes me, and I never end up where I expect I'm going to end up. And I love that.
Yeah, no, me too. And where that's, I mean, I was really enjoying that story. I was all in. And then when it turns into a story of bonding between these two women, I don't know. I mean, it seems ridiculous to say I was happier than I have ever been before, but that's how I felt in the midst of it. I just kind of stopped. We talked about this too. There's so many moments in these stories where you just stop and say, wow, for one reason or another. Either because of an incredible observation, because her eye for details of how we live is so extraordinary, or she said something that I've never thought about before. Shame on me for never having thought about it. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Or because she's gone somewhere where I'm so happy to see her go. Like I was just so excited. And thinking about it, it's a little rom-com. You know, it's a little like My Best Friend's Wedding when the women in the end end up bonding. Um, but because my Kindle just went off on me, if I don't have my Kindle on, I don't have the book. This is the problem with electronic readers. With real books, they don't go off on you.
I have hard copy for backup just in case.
Excellent. Yeah, it was at every turn. I was just really excited about where the stories ended up going. They always go to unexpected places, right? I mean, there's stuff revealed that you didn't expect to see coming at all. Um, yeah.
The thing that you were talking about, the way she renders moments, and I think that's true too with the way in which she renders characters, and the way we talk a lot in our workshops about the difference between showing and telling. And both of us are big proponents of showing and telling, and learning how to tell really well. And I was rereading the story that we're talking about, the second story, Richard of York Gave Battle in Vain, when we're learning a little bit about the protagonist of the story. Um, and she does such a great job of summarizing Rena in this moment, sort of like such a beautiful sort of moment of telling. She said, if you have the book and you're reading, it's on page 40, it's at the top of the paragraph, and it just comes with this like very poetic, wonderful, succinct line. She learned how to press the blade of her heart into the center of someone else's life. Like that is just, I just immediately, when the prose revealed that about that character, I immediately knew who Rena was, and I just felt like I would follow her anywhere. And I think we often get into when people are talking about books and characters, or especially when I'm teaching my classes and my students are talking about characters, I try to move them beyond the binary of likability and unlikability, because I really think that when readers say they don't like a character, what they're really saying is they don't understand a character. And sometimes that can be the fault of the reader, sometimes that can be the fault of the writer, sometimes it can be a mix of the two. But what I love about these stories is that, you know, Evans's work always had these moments of clarification in them, where when I was reading, I immediately understood the character she was writing about.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that that idea of not liking someone because you don't understand them, of course, carries through to life too. And in life, there's that danger of working so hard to understand someone that you feel like you're not allowed to ever dislike anybody, or you're not allowed to ever blame anyone. One of the wonderful things about literature to me is that you don't have that, you don't need to worry about that, that we have the chance to understand anybody. We don't have to have them over for coffee, but we can get inside their minds and inside their hearts. I mean, the points of view in each of these stories give you such a deep plunge in. The outlier, of course, is that fantastic story toward the end of the book, about
Like,
the.
what women say what they want.
Thank you. You're going to have to remind me of the titles every time, because I can't. I'm getting old and the titles vanish from my mind. But yeah, we're in a we're simultaneously in no point of view, and then we get a chance to dip into the point of view that the author decides to allow us to have, just enough for our understanding of what's going on to be pretty complete. The only one whose mind we don't dip into at all is the great artist. We never really do know what he's thinking, and that's very satisfying to me. That, right? So her mastery of point of view, I think, is particularly interesting, and I'd love to hear, you know, what people's thoughts are about that. If you noticed it, if it's only a thing that writers think about, or you know, if you were paying attention to that. Um, what else should we offer up by way of opening comments? Oh, Clara's back. Are people already having things to say?
Hi, Michelle. I was just going to ask, you and Nick both alluded to how you talk about short stories and novellas and sort of what makes a short story, what makes a novella a novella. I was wondering if you could expand on that for those of us who aren't writers in the room.
Such a good question. And honestly, it's a simultaneously a great question and a dumb question, because these days, for a long time, the answer has more to do with marketing than art. But that said, and Nick, you can fill in gaps if I leave anything out. You know, if we think about what a short story is, a short story is going to kind of explode a sort of moment, and a moment could take many years, but it's going to really be focused very tightly, and you're in and out in somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 words, maybe, roughly, where you have this feeling you've taken a complete plunge into something, and then you're out of it. You don't know what's going to happen afterward. You don't know what happened before. So in terms of artistic integrity, I think that's what's happening in short story. A novel, which I would say generally we think of as maybe over 60,000 words, again, very roughly, is giving us a full experience. It's sort of taking us, is building an entire world for us. And a novella gets to play it both ways. You know, a novella gets to have more breadth than a short story, but tends to also be pretty tightly focused. So that, you know, it would be unusual to have a novella that has many, many different points of view, or that takes place over a very long period of time. There are exceptions. The problem is that, and I found this when I've offered my novella course, which I've taught for years, the definitions of these things have changed so much over time. I wrote something that I thought was a novella, a book called Dog, that was definitely not a short story, but it was way too short to be a novel. And it also was very tightly focused on a relationship between a woman and her dog. And anything else in it was there to kind of provide background and guidance to understanding that relationship. It was clearly a novella. And my publisher bought it and said it was a long enough novella to publish as a standalone book, which sometimes happens. And then at the very last minute, they panicked and they decided to call it a short novel because they were afraid if they called it a novella, people wouldn't be willing to plunk down, at that time, $15 for a hardcover. They called it a novel, people would complain that it was too short to be a novel, so they hedged their bets. Totally a marketing decision. It's nice for me because I get to call it a novel, which sounds more impressive. But they're very spongy definitions. You know, we really are talking mostly about length. What do you think, Nick?
So as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about my relationship to short fiction and novels. I have yet to write a novella, but I do write long stories. And I think a lot about stories as being, and to use a term that I stole from someone else, a collection of set pieces. I often teach from this wonderful book by Benjamin Percy called Thrill Me, and he has this chapter on set pieces, which he stole from screenplay writers, which is this idea that a story is usually, not always, there are exceptions. Michelle and I always have to caveat with exceptions, are usually a collection of 2 or 3 important scenes that everything else is kind of wrapped around in the story. And I think that a novella is more set pieces, more scenes, because of the story that is being told. It needs a longer runway. And that it really for me goes into an artistic intention type thing, and what sort of, and I tell my students this, and it's something I have to like repeat to myself again, you know, really like when we're working on pieces, when we're thinking about like our work, like the work sort of tells us what it is more than we tell it. And that's how I sort of explain it to myself. And someone mentioned in the comments about, I think it's funny, we've been talking about this book and we've talked about the stories, but we haven't actually talked that much about the title novella. We've only talked around the form. But I just want to say that I love the title novella. I loved how Michelle and I were talking about this when we met to prepare, how it kind of becomes a sort of mystery almost, because she's going, the protagonist is going to, is it Wisconsin? Is that right, Michelle? Is that where she's going?
Well, she's in Wisconsin to investigate.
To investigate this mystery about what happened to this man. And like any great writer, the mystery, and with all of her stories, the mystery becomes sort of beside the point. It really is about these 2 women who have been in the periphery of each other's lives since they were teenagers, and how their lives have been intertwined, but then have branched off into different paths. One has their whole philosophies are different, have changed. And it really was like, especially the last moment of and I'm assuming that people have
spoilers.
Okay, it's okay to spoil it. All right. But in the last moment with the that act of violence, the gunshot, in a lesser writer's hands, we would have lingered in that moment more, and it would have been sort of exploited for the graphicness of that sort of action. But this novella does something really interesting where it takes that moment and it's sort of like pinned in the back of our minds as readers, and then it goes into this beautiful flashback of this memory between this protagonist and her frenemy, and like this like really complicated scene between them that in some ways is echoing what is happening. with the gun violence that just happened. And I just thought that Michelle talked about like being blown away, and I just thought that just like knocked my socks off.
And if you think about it, when we talk about the difference between a novella and a short story, there's no way that Evans could have accomplished what she does in that novella in a short story. It doesn't have, a short story just cannot have that kind of arc. Even a short story as complex as, say, Alcatraz, which I think is a tremendously complex story, or the story, is it called Anything Can Disappear? Anyone Can Disappear? The story about the young woman who picks up the boy on the bus.
Anything can disappear.
Disappear. I mean, that, that has this huge breadth of story. You read that and you imagine it being turned into a movie. At least I did. Immediately, it seemed like it was a movie. But you can do all of that in a story because you can almost chart the path of this woman, and just the tiny bits of background we get on her. We don't hear much about her family. We just know enough to know that she is not involved with her family, that there's a sad backstory there. She cannot be with them. She is cut off from everyone in the world. You only do that in a short story. Certainly in a novel, you would not have a character where we didn't get any of that underpinning. And we don't need it. So I think it's the rare writer. It is kind of what Nick was saying about the writing telling you what it needs to be. The rare writer sits down and says, I'm going to write a novella. I have an idea. I'm just going to write a novella. I think you start writing something that you think is probably a short story, and sometimes you quickly find out that there's way more here than a short story can comfortably contain. But you know that it's not a novel. The novel is a whole other kind of undertaking. It's sort of fascinating, and so much of it is instinctive. Yeah.
What you said, explaining your own relationship writing Dog and how it was really between this woman and her dog, and everything else sort of provided the underpinning to understand that. I think that's true about the Office of Historical Corrections as well. It's really about these two women and their relationship to each other, and everything else is sort of underpinning to reinforce that. If this were at novel length, I think we would probably have more info and more scenes with the protagonist and her relationship to her boyfriend, and we would probably have more, and we would have more stuff with her family. But really, it sort of starts out at that. We would probably have more information about her job and the intricacies of that, and it sort of gives us all of that in glimmers at the beginning. But then, as the story sort of goes along, I sort of get this sense of a kind of closing in around these two women until we get to that final moment of them together in the past.
I was looking for, there were two kind of recurring lines in this story that felt really important to me, and this is the trouble again with electronic copies, even though I have two of them in front of me. There's the the type, which comes back a couple of times, and there's something else which, if I were still, I keep finding the type. I'm looking through all my highlights. If only I had dog-eared pages. There's another motif, and I will find it eventually. Man, when I start looking through, the type comes over and over and over again as.
That could have almost been the title.
Yeah. I love the current title. I think it's actually a great title, and such a good title for the book itself, but it definitely could have also been the title. There's Anna, damned if I can find it. And this is the unfortunate difference between having creative writers lead a discussion and having regular English professors who would have their notes right in front of them, I'm sure. I will find it eventually as I scroll through on my iPad. What else, Nick? Is there anything else we feel? Oh, I know what I was going to ask you. Do you have favorites in the?
Yes.
Book, but.
Alcatraz, and it's probably my favorite. I mean, I love the title novella too, but I really love Alcatraz, and I love the formal innovation of why women won't just say what they want. The reason why I like Alcatraz so much, and I don't have notes, but I have places dog-eared, and I tweeted about this moment, but it was another example of Evans crystallizing character and a relationship in an economy of words that just sort of sums up the situation so succinctly and really just left me breathless. It happened. If you have the book and you're following along, it's on page 100. It's right before the white space in that last paragraph. It is the narrator reflecting on her relationship with her mother. And it says, "I didn't and still don't dare compare the terms of my life to my mother's, the stakes of my choices to hers. But I understand more now about how it feels to love the excess in people, about how knowing someone else's love will consume you doesn't make it any less real or any less reciprocated, about how you can leave a person behind just to save the thing they value most, yourself."
That's my
And
favorite passage in the whole book.
yeah, yeah, mine too, mine too. And it's just a beautiful rendering of this relationship and this level of understanding that really, I think like what I come to fiction for, I come to it for many things, but one of the things I come to fiction for is to have an artist explain complicated emotions to me in ways that I've never thought about before. And here in this moment, and in several places throughout, Danielle Evans does that, and that's why I think this book is really special.
That's beautifully said. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, those are my favorite stories in the book too. I mean, I do love them all, but Alcatraz is probably my very favorite. And the story about the artist and the woman he makes apologies to is just such a surprising and a really unusual story that I've read it over and over again just to kind of see how she pulled that off. I also remembered the other line in the Office of Historical Corrections, and I feel like it's diagnostic that I had forgotten it because it's such a heartbreaking line. It's, "Do they know I'm human yet?"
Mm.
And that seesaw between "do they know I'm human yet" and "you know the type," which I feel like in some ways those are ideas that run through the entire book. I mean, "Do they know I'm human yet" comes up in the first story when Lissa talks about the way she dresses in order to talk to doctors and just having to make this effort to be seen as human. And in the
It really puts a pin. It really sort of puts a pin in the racism that kind of haunts this book and haunts some of the characters in the book. I think that question is implicitly asked to the protagonist in that story, Boys Go to Jupiter, right? How she behaves toward her. This is a story about a white woman who's gone to college, and her boyfriend posts a picture of her wearing a swimsuit that has the is it the Confederate flag on it, and she sort of makes a series of choices that makes the situation so much worse for her, including terrorizing a Black student on her dorm room hall. And you can sort of see that idea of this like following this character around and realizing, you know, who she sees as human and who she doesn't. And also this idea of like glimmerings of blindness, right, that she has.
Yes, but the other thing about that story that I think is so remarkable, so you know, that's one of my favorite stories too. It's like trying to decide what your favorite child is if you have multiple children, is that she, and this is what comes back to Nick's thought about likableness of characters. You know, she's writing from the point of view of this young white woman who is acting out in these particular ways that have to do with her own grief, right? That make no sense, that are not connected directly to her own grief, but her own grief and her own sense of culpability about the death of her former friend's brother, whom she loved, And so she becomes fully human to us, even though she's being monstrous in the course of the story. And I thought that was an extraordinary choice, and the generosity of spirit that a writer would have to possess to inhabit that character and make her fully comprehensible to us, and make us feel for her, I think it's remarkable to me. I feel like we've talked for a long time. If people have thoughts that we can respond to, we should try to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free, if you would prefer to type, you can use that Q&A feature. You're also welcome to speak. So you can click raise hand and then I'll call on you and you'll be able to unmute yourself to speak. We have a question here from Annie. Could you please speak a little bit about what you think the purpose of the artist's apology story was within the context of the other stories?
Well, I was immediately reminded of what I love about, well, I didn't get a chance to say what I loved about this story. I feel like this story could have so easily been gimmicky because of like all of its innovations, but it's not, and it's so so wonderful in its roving POV. But I think the artist's apology really gets at this question that I've sort of seen crop up in popular culture, on Twitter, this idea of someone who misbehaves, particularly like men misbehaving, and then going on this kind of apology tour, and then expecting once they apologize, they are entitled to forgiveness, perhaps. But there's also like another, again, we talk about layering. There's a layering here because it's never clear, or there's an ambiguity here about whether or not these are sincere apologies or just another sort of show of an artist using this in this current moment of Me Too to make art that in some ways he's attempting to aggrandize himself, right? Like this idea of him like then standing over a made up volcano with stuff that looks like lava, not expecting any of the, or at least it suggested not expecting someone would really toss him in, which is again a failure. It sort of like suggests a kind of failure to understand the kind of harm he's caused in other people's lives. And I really, really like the questions that story asks about, what is the purpose of apologies? What is the nature of forgiveness? Who gets to be forgiven? Who doesn't? And culpability. So sort of like some of the biggest themes in this book, I think, are kind of like boiled down in this piece.
And those lines that I've highlighted in the final novella, do they know I'm human yet? If you think about a way that this story, which seems in some ways like an outlier because it is in terms of its point of view, its apparent subject matter seems different because the other stories are at root, there's a lot of domesticity at those other stories, of family relationships, and matters of race that don't play out importantly in this story. But you could very well ask the non-point of view character in the story, the character that everyone else is revolving around, whose point of view we never get, does he know they're human yet? Right? I mean, has he, by making these apologies, he's acting as if he knows they're human, but we still don't know. And just to play with words, right? We know the type. Yeah, we know the type. I mean, it's as if I do not believe for a second that any writer sits down and thinks, let's put these building blocks together and we'll create meaning in this way, and this is going to speak to that. I mean, these are the kinds of forces that drive a writer or any artist to make work, are going to create motifs that will recur. In other words, I don't think Danielle Evans sat down and said, I'm going to write a bunch of stories in which some of the stories we're going to have violent deaths of siblings, or violent things will happen to siblings, and that will animate the story. I know nothing about Danielle Evans' life. I have no idea if she has a sibling who was violently hurt. or if she had a close friend who had a sibling who was violently hurt. But we do know that this is a preoccupation of hers because it comes up in several stories. We know that sick mothers come up in stories, and dead mothers, and daughters worrying about cancer. There are these kinds of, and the kinds of romantic entanglements that her characters get into or don't get into. The role of female friendships. These are the things that she's obsessed with. And it seems to me that there's a way in which that story, the multiple point of view story about the women harmed by this artist, feels like it doesn't fit in. There's a kind of pause there that's a really useful pause. Now let's think about this and think about the ways that these other subjects kind of lock into this as kind of a not tightly fitting together jigsaw puzzle, but a really interesting postmodern jigsaw puzzle, I guess, where the pieces don't all necessarily fit together perfectly.
We have a comment here from Christy. The author has a powerful way of weaving complex issues into a touching storyline. And then a question from Danielle. Could you talk more about the author's use of what might be considered fantasy, like the Office of Historical Corrections or the artist dying in the volcano he made himself, etc.? It isn't quite believable, yet it seemed to me to somehow reflect reality better than realism would.
That's an interesting question, because to me, it all seems perfectly naturalistic.
Well, I will say it seems also, Danielle seemed to answer the question within it, right? Like this idea of doesn't seem quite believable, but yet it does reflect our reality in a way that seems real to us and seems recognizable. Like in terms of concept, there is a sort of wry irony to the fact that like he constructs a volcano with real lava-like stuff in it, not expecting to fall in, and then falls in. I mean, that is like on a conceptual level. If you told me that just in concept, I would be like, I don't know if that can work. But what is really good, really impressive is that, you know, through the dramatization of these stories, through the language, through the paths that she leads to sort of work up to these moments, I find myself just completely buying into it. The Office of Historical Corrections, I loved that sort of instinct to have like one thing that seems slightly off kilter about this world that is different from our world. And that's this idea of this Office of Historical Corrections, where you go around with a little tape gun.
But it's not. Remember, the Office of Historical Corrections is a mocking nickname for it. It's the
Right.
Institute for Public History.
Right. Yes. Sorry.
No, but I mean, that's the thing. It's actually a really interesting question, Danielle, because I think what she's done is not so different what she does throughout the stories in terms of plot. She takes something that feels plausibly true. Like I can easily imagine an institute for, and it sounds great, for public history, where people are trying to correct this. It sounds like just a slightly exaggerated version of what people are trying to do to get us to recognize the truth, right? And by creating that official institute in a way that feels believable, but is just like a slightly extreme. It's not really fantasy. It's like heightened reality, let's call it. She gets us to think about the consequences of this. And again, in the art world, I've seen a lot of wacky things. I've spent a lot of time in the art world because my husband is a visual artist. It doesn't seem all that unbelievable to me that someone would create either these insane apologies, you know, the pop-up stores and everything else, or that an artist would create, you know, a vat of molten lava. It's just this much beyond what we expect. But if you think about it, the stories keep doing that. You know, there's so much extremism in the stories. Like it takes, you know, fairly conventional situations sometimes and then turns the heat up and up and up. The violence in the stories too. there's kind of a level of extremeness that I think serves the same purpose throughout, which is to make you think about the real life versions of such things. You know, and I admit that I usually am turned off by stories that become extreme, plots that are extreme, certainly turns to violence. I don't like mysteries. I really don't care for fantasy. I'm a very narrow-minded reader. But because she uses these things in the service of getting at these kinds of human truths, I guess, I completely buy into them at every point. And they really, I don't know how else you could accomplish what she accomplished in that story about the artist and the women. I don't know why I can't remember the titles of any of these stories, except for the novella.
Why Women Won't Say What They Want.
Why Women Won't Say What They Want. That's a terrible title. I have to say, that title is just not right. Maybe that's why I don't remember. Sometimes the titles seem to have nothing to do with the stories. The Richard of York one, it's a miracle to me that I can remember that title at all. But that's a complete aside.
I was thinking about that title and rereading that story again. The Richard of York Gives Battle in Vain. I mean, I know Richard III. I've read the Shakespeare play, but I was trying my best to understand how that title related to the story. And my best guess came up because it wasn't mentioned anywhere, right? The sister was an actress.
I'm going to turn off my light. The dog is barking.
The sister was an actress and in plays, but she wasn't in Richard III, I don't think. And but Richard III happens to be one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, and I do know this idea of there is like this theme, of course, towards the end of this idea of like fighting the battle even when you know you've lost, you know, my kingdom for a horse type thing. And there is a kind of move toward the end of that story when those two characters, when the bride and the groomsman's friend end up in the water park, where they get they've just gone down this long slide and they get this flurry of text messages from people at the wedding, including the groom, who has decided not to run away after all, but has come back to the wedding. And it's like, you know, where are y'all? Please come back. The wedding's going to come back on. And like this moment where the bride just sort of like shrugs and takes both of their phones and puts them back in the locker, and they go out to the wave pool. And I just love that moment. That like moment, it's just like just such a release there that I find really, really interesting. And again, is a sort of turn or move in the story that I did not see coming. When I started reading this story, if you would have told me that these two characters were going to end up in a wave pool together in some place called Waterworld, I would not have known how we got to that point, because it seemed a million miles away from where the story began. And I think that's what's so exciting about Danielle Evans as a writer.
Agreed. Sorry for my my life with a 10-month-old puppy. I still don't know what was happening, but she thought someone was coming to kill us, I guess. What else have we got?
So we've got about 15 minutes left, or a little less than 15 minutes. Again, feel free to submit in the Q&A if you'd like to type, or we'd love to hear from you by speaking. So you can raise hand and then I'll just unmute you. That won't turn on your video, so no worries there. You'll just be sort of phoning in. Michelle and Nick, so many of these stories happen in Midwest areas, and I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that in the book or in the collection.
I think it's interesting that Michelle and I, neither of us are from the Midwest, and we live in, but I've lived, I guess, a decade now, a decade now in the Midwest, coming from the South. And yeah, I think there is a kind of, I can't remember if this was in the book or someone said this in a question, but Midwestern nice, that's like our Midwest nice, you know, that's sort of interrogated in this book. The idea of like whiteness in the Midwest is interrogated in this book. And I was thinking a lot about that when I was reading it. I was just thinking, yeah, Michelle, what do you think?
Well, I'm actually looking at some of these. I'm looking up some of the references. So Midwest nice was a steady, polite gaslighting I found sinister, a forced humility that prevented anyone from speaking up when they'd been diminished or disrespected. Less, oops, oh, damn it. I'm in the middle of reading a quote, but you get the idea. The Kindle jumped away from me. You know, I've been in the Midwest. I am a New Yorker. I always call myself a New Yorker because once a New Yorker, always a New Yorker. And I think the same is true for Southerners. You know, you can be away for generations and you're still a Southerner. My husband would say that about being a Texan. But I've been in the Midwest now for unbelievably 37 years because I left New York originally to go to Iowa for graduate school and never went back to live there. And I still, I don't find it sinister, Midwestern niceness. I experience it, and I think as a white woman of relative privilege, I experience it differently from the way many of the characters in this book do. But it makes me tremendously impatient. I was thinking just the other day, I was thinking about this because of reading this book. I spent a lot of time in a makeshift dog park in my neighborhood. So many of us in Clintonville who have adopted dogs in quarantine, taken over a schoolyard of a school that's been closed. And it's a generally congenial group of mostly people who are from here, and then a few faculty members who, of course, almost by definition are from other places in the country and in the world. But what they have in common, what we all have in common, is we've lived here for a long time. And every once in a while, someone will show up with a nasty dog. And no one will say to the owner, don't bring that dog here. That dog is ruining things for everyone else, except me. And everyone now looks toward me to be the one who'll be the jerk, kind of. And it fascinates me that baked into the Midwestern temperament is this kind of unwillingness to step up and challenge someone who's behaving badly. I mean, this is on a very small scale compared to the kinds of situations that Danielle Evans is invoking. But it's what I see daily, and I would love to understand it. Like, if your dog has been attacked multiple times, why are you still not able or unwilling to say, stop bringing your dog here? Like, what is that piece? I don't understand it yet, not even after almost 4 decades here. Now, people are the same way in the South, though, aren't they? You never, or unless in the South you do it kind of false.
I was thinking about how, and again, this is very limited, but I was thinking about how someone in the South would, like some of my aunts who are really nice and like to avoid confrontation, but they would address that, but in a nice way. And it's like, say something like, oh, bless your heart, your dog is like really, really a bad dog, right? Like, what are you going to do about your dog? Like, does your dog, like, how do you predict, you know?
That wouldn't it be more like, oh, bless your heart, bless your dog's heart.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
high-spirited.
Yeah. And
for the still dog part.
yeah. So I think there's that. Yeah. But I was like, but when you were describing what you experienced at the dog park, I was like, oh my God, that's why I love the Midwest so much, because that's me. Like, I'm like someone who's very conflict avoidant, and not in my fiction, but in real life, I'm very much that way. But like you said, I love the way Danielle Evans uses her fiction to sort of interrogate that and challenge, like, what are some of, how do you take this idea, this sort of trope, and like interrogate it and sort of try to look under it and see what some of the more nefarious underpinnings are.
Yeah. Because we think of it as, I mean, here's what I used to say about after living in the Midwest for a while and hearing people here talk about who visited New York and found New York so unfriendly. Because in New York, people don't say, have a nice day. They don't smile at each other on the street and say, well, how are you? If they don't know, people think you're insane if you said, how are you, to someone you have never seen before, or if you even said hello to them. And my response to that was, it's not that people in New York are unfriendly, it's that they're not fake. Like, I know that the cashier at Kroger doesn't really care if I have a nice day, so I wish she wouldn't tell me to have a nice day. It feels really fun. I felt cold and Caulfield, bunch of phonies. But I think that's one of the things that Danielle Evans is getting at. Where was she raised? Do we know?
I have no idea. No.
About the author. You think we would know that? Whoops, I'm zipping down to it so quickly.
I know that she spent a lot of time in the Midwest because I think for a while she taught at a university in the Midwest. I can't remember where, if it was I want to say maybe she taught at Wisconsin for a while, and then now she teaches in the prestigious writer workshops at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, I'm looking actually. She's taught at a bunch of different places before she landed at Johns Hopkins. But I don't know where she was brought up. You think we would know that? It's an interesting idea, whether she's interrogating it from the inside or the outside. It's something I have never spent any time writing about, and so I was kind of excited to see her talking about it in the way that she talks about it.
We have a couple of comments from Susan. I think that Midwest nice is a sort of passivity, as you have suggested. It is not as nice at Midwest as, excuse me, it is not as nice as Midwesterners want to think it is. It is opposed, yes, phony, as you say. I come from the Midwest. And from Donna, as a Midwestern-born Wisconsin and now living in Maryland, and my master's from OSU, we are not phony. And she says, sending with a smile and not a passive smile.
Well, and phony is probably, phony is a New Yorker's interpretation, but phony is probably the wrong word. It's polite, right? And politeness, to a New Yorker, politeness is a kind of phoniness.
And see, I'm on the completely other end of the spectrum. I love politeness. Like I love the niceties of life and people saying have a nice day and like, all of those things. I'm one of the rare Southerners who will say bless your heart and really mean it. Like I love that.
Well, I don't mean to make myself sound like some kind of monster. I say please and thank you. And even when I tell someone to take their dog out of the dog park, I don't.
You said please and thank you.
And I do say it. There's that little bit of Southern, I do say it in terms of being concerned about their dog too, because their dog might get hurt. I don't mean to keep coming back. I'm obsessed with the dog. I'm with the dog 24 hours a day. It's all I think about is the dog, who is now asleep at my feet, thank God. But it is, I would love to dig further into it actually and understand, like, how did it come to be that in the Midwest there's this sort of niceness? Certainly not the weather that inspires people to be nicer, right? Like, where does it come from? How far back does it go? It's not niceness, it's politeness and conflict avoidance, right? Non-confrontation. New Yorkers have the reputation of being brusque and confrontational. I am not brusque, but I'm certainly confrontational. And if it's the expression in Yiddish that's translated into English is, if it's on her mind, it's on her lips. That's pretty much the way I function, which is not necessarily the healthiest way to function, but I'm so accustomed to it that it still surprises me that other people don't just say what's on their mind at all times.
Well, I think too, also, like, we're speaking in broad terms, and one of the things that this book does really well is takes that kind of conception / misconception about a particular place and adds nuance to it, which I find really, really valuable.
I'm looking at this, here's a passage. I was certain it would indeed be charming. She's talking about Cherry Mill, right, in the novella. But the upper Midwest made me moody. People made me feel like I was being asked to speak a language I'd never learned and in which I was constantly misunderstood. When I lived here, it had taken me months to recognize that the pushy advice strangers gave about things like where to buy cheaper bottled water and which store was having a sale were not meant to be intrusive or judgmental or presumptuous, but simply friendly. That they were considered friendly whether or not I experienced them that way, And it took me even more months for me to understand that long, meandering conversations full of small talk, the kind I considered a brief prelude to real human interaction, were never going to open up into genuine discussions or open expressions of feelings on their own. They were only going to restart on a loop. And this, I mean, I read that passage and I thought, yes, that's exactly how I feel. That's what I have been struggling with all these years. It's kind of awesome. That's all. I read the passage only to point to its awesomeness.
I know you all had a couple of recommendations for other short story reading. If you'd like to share those before we wrap up.
Yeah, for us.
Well, I have three. So the first one, this book is 20 years old. It won the Pulitzer Prize. She has a novel coming out soon, pretty soon, right, Michelle? Jhumpa Lahiri, Interpreter of Maladies. I love this book so much. It's a collection of stories. Deals a lot with this idea of identity and place and placelessness, family. Just a beautiful, beautiful book. It was her debut book and it won the Pulitzer Prize and was just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. The other one that I wanted to talk about was Thunderstruck by Elizabeth McCracken. And the title story, Thunderstruck, is actually a novella. And it's a really, really beautiful novella about a family that goes to France and spends a summer in Paris. And just so if you're interested in that form, this is another great one to check out. And this book actually won the year it was published, the Story Prize, which is a great prize that's awarded every year to what's considered to be the best short story collection. So if you're interested in more really great short story collections, that would be a great prize to go online and look up to see what won and what were the finalists. And then the last one is a book that was published a couple years ago called Lot by Brian Washington. I teach from this story collection a lot. I actually got to speak to the author about his debut novel, Memorial, with Linda Cass at Gramercy a couple months ago. And this book came out first, and it's just a wonderful stories about a particular place in Houston. All of the stories take place in particular neighborhoods in Houston. It's almost like invoking the Midwest. It's almost like his Winesburg, Ohio, almost. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful collection. It plays around with POV very much in the same way that Danielle Evans does. And so if you like this book, I would bet my bottom dollar you would like these three as well.
I have three more for you, and I don't have covers to show, but I really want to second Jhumpa Lahiri. I feel like if you love this book, you will definitely love Jhumpa Lahiri, and not just that collection, but all of her books, with the exception of the most recent, of the memoir, and possibly the new novel. But the earlier books. I want to recommend Curtis Sittenfeld's You Think It, I'll Say It, which is one of my favorite story collections of the last 5 years. And Danielle, the book that Nick told me about, Danielle Lazarin's Back Talk.
Back Talk. Oh, how could I not remember that book? That book is great.
Great. And another one is there's an Ohio State connection to, which is quite new book. Christopher Koch's. Oh my God, now I forgot the title. What's the title of it?
You Would Have Told Me Not To.
Would Have Told Me Not To, yes. Which is, I mean, if I tell you that the stories are in part about masculinity, don't let that put you off, because it's a kind of investigation into masculinity in such a tender, generous, loving, critical way. And again, there's stories about families, about marriage and romance and parents and children, and the characterizations are so rich. I do think it's a collection that my mother
I think you're muted now.
All right, Michelle, you can unmute yourself.
I didn't unmute. I didn't mute myself. That's interesting. My guess is my mother couldn't figure out the new link and is now calling to say, I missed it. Anyway.
One quick thing about the Danielle Evans collection, Back Talk, because we talked about the short story and the novella form, but what's really great about the Back Talk short story collection, there's some flash pieces in there. And those are like really, really short stories. And so if you're interested in seeing like a form of the short story on the other end of the spectrum, one that's just like a brief flash, almost like a prose poem, that would be a good collection to check out.
Oh, wonderful. We will include all of those recommendations in the follow-up email that you'll receive. So if you miss the name of the author or the book, we'll make sure you get that. Nick and Michelle, huge thank you. Really appreciate your time and conversation today. It was great. Thank you to all of you for coming. Glad you're able to figure out the link. We will be sharing out a recording. So if you know folks who weren't able to get on, know that that will be coming your way soon. We hope you can join us at the end of this month on March 31st. At 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll be discussing Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. So we'll be moving on to poetry from here. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Have a nice day, if we can say that.
Yes, and bless your hearts.